It was very late in the year, with crisp, clear air and ice on the rocks when the final body was recovered. I was there helping to package and then transport the body to the extraction point. I can still feel the muted jubilation of being part of a closing of a mission, and most importantly, sending the deceased remains back to their family. Colleagues congratulated each other on the trail as we all realized this chapter had been closed on this protracted incident. Having been the family liaison officer and field operator gave me a unique perspective. It underlined the need to keep the two worlds insulated from each other and the hidden emotional load that months of searching had on me. The mission had crept under my skin and had quietly become almost obsessive. Having the skills to work in technical terrain had opened the window to side hikes and searches. Every time I walked the trail, I replayed the conditions on that fateful day. I noted how the area had changed as the summer shadows deepened. On previous searches, smell, as much as sight, had played a part in discovery, and I took time to explore with all of my senses. When through back channels the family invited me to the funeral, I unhesitatingly said no. I knew that I had been far too deeply involved and needed to firmly step away. The incident has never left me. Years later, at a training I attended, the accident was part of a discussion. There was an analysis and quotes from the family and the distributed materials, and upon reading the text I found myself in tears, trying to explain what was going on. I had been part of the story from the beginning, and needed it to end. This is an excerpt from the book, When Accidents Happen, Managing Crisis Communications as a Family Liaison Officer by Mutlow, my guest in this episode. I'm your host, Tim Conrad. Welcome to the Wildfires, Floods, and Chaos Communications podcast with Search and Rescue Family Liaison Officer and author, Mutlow. Moose, thanks for being here. And I know you're coming from the search and rescue world, and we haven't had anybody on the show yet from the search and rescue world. So can you tell me what search and rescue provides as an emergency service?
Well, thanks for having me along on the podcast. Search and rescue has various forms throughout the world. I'm sure with your global reach, there'll be somebody who will say, oh, yes, but it's like this in my country. In the United States, with the search and rescue group I'm involved with, it's a federal-based operation. It's run through the National Park Service, and it responds to about 220 incidents in Yosemite National Park every year. It's a big difference from most search and rescues throughout the United States that are staffed by volunteers. I'm actually paid when I go out on a mission for very specific ratings for different types of rescue, whereas most people just turn up with their gear and put in long hours without any financial remuneration. And we span the whole gamut as far as what we're responding to, whether it's up on the walls, like vertical rescue and extraction, through the ground search, swiftwater rescue. And a lot of stuff that I'm actually involved with tends to favor more on missions that we're looking for someone or we're dealing with a fatality.
And you mentioned it's a mixture of volunteer and paid. It is mostly volunteer up here in Canada. What's it like down there in the United States?
Majority of search and rescue groups are all volunteer. You'll find some that are multi-jurisdictional, that'll span across agencies that allow you to do what's called AD hire, which is an administrative rating that allows you to come in at certain costs per hour. And then a lot of it's run through sheriff departments or local police forces will have as part of it will be search and rescue. There'll be somebody in charge of it.
Okay, so you filled the role of the family liaison officer and you've worked around 100 fatalities with search and rescue operations. Obviously, you've worked a number of successful operations as well. So tell us about your role and how you connect incident command to families.
So the family liaison officer acts as the representative for the incident commander interfacing with the affected family or group of friends during a mission, whether we're doing a search or recovery. You're high up in that incident command system, the ICS, so you're privy to all the information flowing backwards and forwards. And alongside the incident commander, you become something of an editor. You start to figure out what information can be passed on to the family at the right time in the right manner. And you're taking families through that first stage of notification. Hey, something's happening, something's gone wrong. And it could be a really good outcome where you say we found their loved one, or I work all the way through when we're doing notifications and next steps when there's been a fatality.
So this is a role that empathy is really important. And you've mentioned to me that you must be an empathetic communicator to be in this role. What is an empathetic communicator?
I think for a lot of the work that I do, the empathetic part of it is the ability to take a step back and look at people who are hurting and in pain, a little bit confused, and recognize you're not actually putting yourself in their position, but you're putting yourself in a position of kindness and recognizing they're in crisis, and you help them navigate a complicated landscape. And if you can back that up with a degree of technical knowledge, I come from climbing or swiftwater background, so I understand the ins and outs of working in those environments. You can give an informed presence for when they have difficult questions that might be, well, how are we going to do that extraction, or how the helicopter gets involved? You haven't got to call an expert in at that point because you have the necessary information. But the big thing is to be kind and not take anything personally. People, when they're facing loss, have different ways of interacting. Some of them withdraw, some of them get quite loud, some of them get very distracted. There's no blueprint that says this is how you should be behaving. And that's what we as family liaison officers really encourage people to do, is whatever they're feeling, let it out. They don't have to say sorry. They don't have to excuse themselves. We're the buffer between instant command and the mission, so the mission doesn't get distracted. So we absorb that. That idea of empathetic or compassionate objectivity is a key to doing the job well.
It's a key skill to have now, I think. And as a crisis communicator, in most organizations dealing with an emergency, empathy is huge. It's where mental well-being is very much tested with everyone that's involved, but especially families and friends of the person that's missing. And so, being there with them in those moments and guiding them through that is really important. I'm curious as to what tools and techniques you use when communicating with families.
I listen a lot. A lot of it is taking notes and watching where people are going and recognizing that you don't have to fill space the whole time with chatter or discussion about what's going on. It's being comfortable in silence and having a family run their communication needs in a way. You respond to where they're at. And I think it's keeping it simple and digestible. If you see that look across their face where they get a bit confused, you need to back up and maybe change the way you're offering the information. If you're just talking at them, they don't necessarily absorb it. They might get an emotional reaction, but you have to back that up with a written note that helps remind them about the conversation they had an hour ago. Or when they pose that impossible question, you give yourself the space to come back a bit later with maybe an area expert, a subject matter expert, to come in and address that pertinent point in a manner that they perhaps need a little bit more rounded information. The family liaison officer a lot of time is the air traffic controller. They're hearing stuff and they can do a certain amount of figuring out how to land. But the other thing, time you just have to turn around and know you haven't got the answers to everything. You have to have humility and know when they say you might be able to answer it, but you're kind of shooting in the dark a little bit. You need to back off and find somebody or the phrase you need to work on to make sure it lands in a way that they truly can digest it.
I'm curious what families are like when you're working with them through this. What's been the experience that you've had working one-on-one with families? And of course, I want you to keep in mind too, like while the search is happening, they may be getting information from other places through friends and family. And what's that impact on them?
I don't think you can generalize a family's interaction when a tragedy is struck. They run the full gamut, as I said, between quiet acceptance, loud disagreement, confusion, silence, withdrawing. It runs everything. One of the problems that we run up against is this myriad of information points. And pretty early on, I talked to families about the use of social media or starting to scan social media or local news for information, because we never want to be in a position where a family is caught flat-footed. The idea of the family says, I don't know what's going on, is the thing we're striving to avoid. So we lay, not necessarily ground rules, but guidance, and we make regular, clear timetable for when we're meeting. Early on in an incident, we might meet every couple of hours or even on the hour to start to paint a picture about what resources are on the ground or what the weather's doing. And as it goes deeper and deeper into days or multiple weeks, you start to spread those contacts out. But early on, it's about availability. You sit in the room on those first 6 hours, you might be in the room 5.5 hours, not necessarily right up against them, but you're accessible and you're monitoring for what they might need. It's a little bit of a prediction. You have to think about, well, do they need food? Do they need water? Do they need somewhere to stay? You're looking after those very low basic needs in order to make sure that when you come up with that meeting with the incident commander, that they're in a position to get the most out of it.
Several courses are being developed, and I'm happy to let you know that the first course will be on CanadianTraining.ca really soon. Job interviews, public speaking, messaging, and speaking to media. How to speak more confidently to groups of people in many settings will be our first course. It will teach you skills useful for many settings which require you to speak, where your nerves may be winning the battle right now. Launching soon. Sign up for updates and early access at www.canadiantraining.ca to learn how to speak more confidently to groups of people. Subscribers will also get free checklists, guides, and more. CanadianTraining.ca. Learn from our mistakes. Someone should. So you're doing a lot of setting the stage of, by the sounds of things, and preparing them for what information is going to be possibly coming at them in the next stage. Is that what I'm hearing?
Choreography. When I'm training, I have a picture of a dance step and talk about a really good family liaison officer recognizes the breadth of what's available in incident command that can help paint a more complete picture for families and know when to bring those in. It isn't you flood the market really early on with maybe. What you want to get in there with is facts. And you want to be in a position where they've got enough of a foundation that they can listen to something and go, oh, I need to take it up a step or two. If you're expecting them to be at a point where they fully understand a grid search with multiple helicopters and ground crews and dog teams right at the get-go, they probably aren't. They need to understand distance, how many hours out they are, or how many hours. The timeline is something I roll out really early with them that actually starts to integrate them into what's happening. Like I'll say, we contacted you at 11 o'clock, you got here at 1 o'clock. Let's take a few steps back and know when that first call came in was at 7:30 last night. So we're talking about in excess of 16 hours to this point now. So they start to get that scale and I physically paint it. You start to help them learn how they can get information.
I think that's a really important piece to pull on. You had mentioned earlier about some kind of thing where you write things down. Can you give me a little bit more on that and what that looks like and how you kind of take people through that writing down of what the status of things is?
So early on in a meeting, especially if we're doing a search and they're trying to figure out the resources that are on the ground or in the air when the dog teams are coming in, you can talk to them and then ask them 15 minutes later what happened and they'll have zero recollection. So I write a script out that I'll sit next to somebody and I'll show them the notes I'm going to talk through. And I will physically give them that copy. I'll date and sign it and I'll take a photograph of it because that's what I've given over. And I'll come back to that at my next meeting and say, hey, let's just do a quick reminder of what we talked about an hour and a half ago. When you look over that, is there anything that you start asking a question about or something that wasn't clear? And we go through it. So we reload all the facts as we know them. So now we're going to a second set of facts. They've started to puzzle this together. It's not out of the blue. And that's the perfect thing. That you go back a lot over notes. You go back probably the day before and say, you don't say to somebody, oh, you remember that. You say, let's go back to the notes and see what was yesterday. And you empower them at that point because then they have a script for when they're on the phone talking to their family in another time zone about what's happening. And that all the time builds to the family does know what's happening. I think if there's a full-on investigation, there's a hesitancy sometimes with law enforcement to fully divulge, hey, the scale and scope of what's happening. I think sometimes they hold that too tight and keep a family on an edge, which is unnecessary and hurtful. So I work really hard with LE to really lay out as much as we can without getting in the way of what is an ongoing investigation.
Yeah, absolutely. Just as you're saying this, the crazy thing that happened here, I'm in Kamloops in British Columbia, and there's a gentleman, 20-year-old guy from Kamloops, that was way up north here in British Columbia and went missing on October 7th in the mountains and was just found this week.
Yeah, I saw this.
50 days he survived out there. It's been minus 25 Celsius, and there's snow down in the mountains up there, and they found him. And he's doing fine. He was released from hospital this morning. So an unusual case because of that search, that search had come to an end and they had not found him and they had moved on to the next stage. So I'm curious to hear what families that are in that period of search and a mission that as it moves to that next stage, what happens next at that point?
That's about front loading. the idea you very early on, I don't necessarily talk about hope. I say I have optimism. I'll look at somebody and say, I think that young man had a good background in outdoor skills. I think he was a hunter. I would talk about that with the family, say, oh, he has these not rudimentary, he has really good practice skills. So that gives us optimism. It's something that's happened that maybe he can move around or he could seek shelter. He has some expertise to make a fire. That's why we're optimistic. And then as we've gone through multiple days, I start to get a bit more pragmatic and talk about reality. And it will say something like, if we don't find a significant clue in the next 24 hours, we're going to be having a different conversation at the end of that day. And I'll say, what does that mean? We'll say we have to look at the reality of timeout, weather, resources on the ground, and see how we can start to move forward if we don't have any clues. And then quite often they'll say, are you giving up? And I say, no, we're not giving up. We just haven't found any good clues to help guide us to figuring out where your loved one is. And that's going to be our next step, is a good clue. So I'm going to call the incident commander in or the ops chief and say, this is the plan going forward in the next 3 days. It's hard because you see it multiple times where families have a hard time not moving on, but letting go legitimately. But there's other operations running that are pulling resources elsewhere. So you have to navigate this landscape of, we had so much resources to look for your loved one, but this other things happened, and we're in that golden hour potentially to really make a difference over there, and we're getting diverted resources. And that is a very tricky thing to negotiate. I've had people say, you aren't looking for that, my loved one, because they're from a culturally diverse group, and you have to navigate that. So how do you navigate that? I brought in a speaker of that person's language to sit down and have a conversation so they weren't struggling in English to understand what was going on. And it's just facts.
So I've worked many times with search and rescue as a firefighter and during large emergencies as well. They provide lots of roles here in Canada. And we've used search and rescue for going door to door to do evacuations, to directing people to the right evacuation routes. And then I've also been involved with them when we've done everything from ice rescue to water rescue and even animal rescue. So all sorts of things. And they're just an incredibly valuable group. I absolutely love working with search and rescue every opportunity I get. And like many in emergency response, there's a difficult honesty that comes with the role that we've been talking about. Not all calls for help end well. Tell me about the danger of hope and how those, how have the responses and how do you prepare families for realistic outcomes?
One of the things I never do is reference other incidents. When they say, well, what's happened before? I say every incident's different. We're teaching this incident as a single episode. They inform us a little bit, time of the year, terrain, but they're also different that we really focus on here and now. And I talk through with families with the terrain, the landscape, the amount of hours we put out there to start to get them to the point where they're saying things potentially like, what happens if we don't find him? What happens if at the end of the week there have been no clues? And then I'm pragmatic and succinct and clear and say, well, the search would be suspended. We're not giving up, but it would be suspended. And we work really hard to distance operators and technicians from the family so that someone's motivated shout, which is we're going to find them, which is what they hold in their hearts and gets them out there every day, isn't an empty promise to a family. That's the key point, is any commitment that we make, we're able to honor it in the moment and throughout the duration of the mission. And if you started from that honest point and you've been consistent, you have the best shot of having the family be able to process that and actually understand it.
Yeah, it's something I've often referred to as hard truth. It's a hard truth to say. It's a hard truth to believe. But in the moment that you're in at that particular time, and it's important for you to hear that.
It's a fact. I think that the early on in most incidents, you'll hear me say, I'm going to commit to you to giving you facts, an undeniable truth. And an undeniable truth is something that I have vetted 3 times. So I've seen somebody who's been on scene, I've talked to the helicopter crew, and the IC's told me. So that's an undeniable truth. And if I can't get to an undeniable truth, I'm not going to commit to an answer. It's not that I'm choosing not to answer you. What I'm telling you is I haven't got that depth of knowledge to be 110% sure what I'm telling you is absolutely true. And we need to work in absolute truths right now.
I had, in responding to wildfires last summer, I had instances where people wanted to hear something different than what I was telling them. And I said, I understand that where you're going, and I can understand where you want me to answer and what you want me to say, but I can't say that because that would not be a factual piece of information. I'm here to tell you the truth as to where we are at this moment. And it's a hard moment to have with people, but they really do appreciate it. Maybe not in the moment, but maybe later on. It sometimes takes a bit of time.
And if they felt they've been listened to, a big part of my job is to be a witness and to listen to this expansive question that takes 8 minutes to sort of get to the point of what the question is. And I'm taking notes and I say, okay, let me just double check what you're asking me is this. And I'll show them what my note is. And I'll say, yeah, that's my question. I say, I haven't got an answer for you right now, but I'm going to go back to the incident commander. I'm going to come back here in 2 hours with either some facts, or it may be that we haven't got an answer at this time that we can give you. And I leave with my script. I come back in 2 hours. I remind them this is what they sent me off on a mission to do. And if I have something to deliver them, I deliver it. Otherwise, I say I haven't got an answer.
The interesting thing about search and rescue is that you are in the emergency services and providing this, and it's quick to respond. The incident, though, generally stretches into a long event. It's days, weeks, and sometimes even months. It's not like sometimes with a fire or a flood that's very immediate and happening right in front of you. This is a slow and methodical process as it happens. And so I really appreciate you taking us through and helping us understand that. You had mentioned earlier about the leading questions to guide people to answers as being quite effective. Can you take us through what that kind of process is and a bit of a step-by-step on how you really get people how you lead people through those questions and how you lead them through the questions to ultimately find their own answer?
Early on, it's about building relationships. So it's hearing their story. You're on this accelerated path of intimacy, because if you're looking for their loved one, they aren't going to just share the details which we need, which might be color of their eyes, their weight, their level of physical fitness. They start sharing stories of shared camping trips, or we had this great birthday party. And I use that as an opportunity to ask questions and start to understand who this person is, whether they were a fun person, how much resilience have they got. And a lot of times when we're talking about things is I remind them who we're looking for. So I'll say, Kenny, remind me again about his outdoor experience. And as I start talking about this fun trip and we did this camping thing and he fell in the river and he managed to dry himself out. And I say, oh, these are really good bits of information. So if he was out there in this storm, do you think he's somebody who could build a shelter or maybe make a fire? And they start saying yes or like no. You go, oh, why'd you say that? It's like, well, they got a bit of a disability and this is a new bit of information. We hadn't had this information. So you basically just start a conversation. And what starts to evolve, I've found, with not all groups, but a pretty high percentage, is they start to realize the magnitude of what's involved. And then they start to almost self-screen at what their questions might be, especially in a group. You have somebody who'll say something and somebody else will say, well, actually, yesterday we talked about this, or let's get the map out and look at it. If you can get them in a conversation rather than just talking at them, then they feel like they're part of the team. And that belonging is a really important place to be respectful in managing what their expectations and needs are.
Absolutely is. Taking that time to listen and to guide people through those conversations it's really, I found very effective. And just to be there in that conversation with them, both helping them to understand the situation that they're in and where they're at, but also helping that you're able to help them understand where you are at in the organization and what you are doing.
And a lot of times you can complicate their lives by over asking. So we typically will say, let's have binary choices. Do you want to eat something or do you want to listen to what I'm going to say? It's as simple as that. Do you want to eat or do you want to listen? Can we eat and listen? Well, we've got to go out and get pizza. But like you're at that point where you're simplifying their decision-making because complexity is coming. When they leave our jurisdiction, it's going to get complex because they're dealing with a body and a memorial and all of these other things that are going on. So a lot of the conversation we have are very, very simple. And that's a critical part to having something that's digestible.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you believe that families should never have to be in front of media during an event. Why is that?
I think they have a choice. I think we pretty early on will say, hey, there's media interest or social media is picking it up. What do you want to do? And they can exercise their choice and we can help with that. But rarely in the missions that we work is media necessarily a helpful adjunct, because you already know where you're looking, or you've got enough people on the ground to respond. And news is sensational ultimately. It's about how bad the weather is, or how big the odds, how low the odds are as far as like finding someone. And families don't necessarily figure out that they're going to be on this pretty rocky road, and it can turn fast. So I would never say to somebody you can't do something, but I'll bring a public information officer in, and I'll say, hey, if you're going to talk to media, let's bring somebody in who can talk through the different media outlets, and they can answer questions, and we can frame it up for a location that you want to be when you're meeting them. And I would never participate in a media contact as a family liaison myself. That's my role, is in a position that needs to be quieter. It needs to be out of view in a way. But yeah, the media landscape has changed so radically, and it is so cruel when it goes sideways, that is an added burden for a family to manage that I would suggest they don't need to do.
Yeah, I have rarely worked events where the family has gone out in front of media. They've often initially wanted to, and once, they had some conversations with them to tell them what that experience is like and what it could be like for them going forward, they often decide not to do it and to let us pass the message along on their behalf. So I do like keeping families away from media, and that's because it can be something that adds a lot of stress to them. It doesn't really add a lot of value ultimately in that moment, especially for search and rescue, I would think.
And a lot of times it's down to empowerment. A family feels incredibly disempowered when all of these people are doing the thing that they kind of want to be involved with. So when you say no to a family, we need to be aware of, that's kind of removing their ability to make some decisions. So it's always choices within a framework. And so if they chose to go down that, I wouldn't have judgment on it, and I would maybe change the way I'm being a family liaison. In Britain, for instance, the family liaison officer is typically a commissioned police officer who becomes the spokesman for the family out to media. So there are different cultural norms here. There are different jurisdictions have different approaches.
Did you know that monarch butterflies can fly up to 160 kilometers or 100 miles in only one day? How do you measure if someone has experience in their field, kind of like a butterfly? Have they sent evacuations by road, boat, flight, canoe, and trail? Well, I didn't send the one by canoe, but I worked with the person who did. Do they need a team with experience with hurricanes, murders, sports, landslides, airlines, financial crisis, pandemics, wildfires, fisheries, floods, destination marketing, ice jams, dental, healthcare, or industrial incidents? We've got all those covered among our associate team, and most of them many times over. We can help you with public relations, public engagement, or marketing you may need, including training. We work with many organizations, including First Nations, governments, nonprofits, and business. We excel at the toughest work, which has drawn us to disasters, emergencies, crises, and issues. Yet we love to work on happier projects. So if you've got some of those, we're in on them too. We've organized large multi-day events, led community outreach and public education programs, facilitated public participation in dignitary sessions. You name it, we've kind of done it. Learn more about us at butterflycommunications.ca, where you can join our newsletter list. Now, fly back to the Wildfires, Floods, and Chaos Communications podcast. Next up, I have a statement of yours that I want you to elaborate on. What is the idea of truth?
Well, I think truth is, right now, truth is a very interesting thing. It's all down to perspective. Well, it's always been about perspective. I work really hard to be, we talked a little bit about undeniable facts, and I will prefer not to say anything unless I got anything to back it up. Even if I've got a pretty good idea, I won't say much. People want to believe what they want to believe. And if you give them too much room, or they have a void of information, they start to populate that with their own perspective of what's actually happening. And so it's critical here to not have those voids develop, and make sure you've given the family the tools to understand how they can start to fill that, or know when it's going to get filled, so that they don't go shopping around for other things to fill it. Because often those things are malignant. They're things that detract from the operation. They might be external appeal for resources that are unqualified that flood the area, and you end up with dog teams that are not certified, or dive teams that carry no liability and have never dived at altitude, so they're unqualified. And there's a monetarization now of response. There are groups out there that turn up to look for for cars in rivers that are getting their YouTube dollars, and they're having a good time and they're trying to do good work, but their motivation is a lifestyle. It's not the mission. And what we're trying to do is have credible responders and searchers doing technical work that's collecting clues along the way so we're not destroying evidence to help complete the story. And when there's an unresolved disappearance and it is years have gone by, I can't even begin to imagine what that's like for a family. So that void has grown bigger and bigger because they're disconnected with command, because command's been taken apart because they moved on to other incidents. That's the place where the truth disappears really quickly, because then it becomes a thing of fantasy. The idea of kidnapping or violent loss or something criminal has come in to try and explain what was just a series of bad luck and maybe some bad decision making.
Yeah, it is. In British Columbia here, we just like you are in the mountains. So we tend to see lots of different search and rescues throughout the year, and they end in different ways. That's one thing I can say, that watching some of those that have not been gone so well, there's no end chapter for them at this stage. And they're just unfortunately left dangling, and they are just still listed as missing. We don't know what the end story was for that person. And watching families, I know, kind of shift their truth over those years is really quite interesting. There's one particular case here just outside of Kamloops, Ryan Stutka, and his mother wrote a book about that and her experience afterwards, because he has really vanished without a trace. And so just the whole experience that she's gone through, both during the initial response and then the years since, is really interesting in her book.
Unresolved is a very hard place to be. There's this idea of ambiguous loss, which is linked more towards act of terrorism, where a plane just is blown out of the sky and there's nothing is recovered, or actually memory care with somebody who has Alzheimer's or dementia, where their partner sees the person they love, but they're a shell of who they were, because that inside that spirit has disappeared. And that ambiguous loss, I think, is what people experience a lot with disappearance that is unresolved. And that leads to that disquieting, that idea of, when will I find peace? And that is a very hard thing to be around. And to live it is, again, so much further on than just being around it. And that's where compassion comes in, and kindness. That phone call every year that's on the person who's disappeared's birthday, and it always comes into the station, and somebody goes, "Oh, they're phoning up again." It's 5 minutes to be kind. It's 5 minutes to be present and be a witness, and it pays off. That respect helps that person, but it's also respect for ourselves, to have less judgment of others who are hurting or have lost someone. I see a lot of judgment in SAR and emergency services, where people with very little information say terrible things about the person who's disappeared, and say, "Oh, terrible decision making," or, "What were they thinking?" And we actually don't need to think that. We don't need to waste energy on it. We just need to be kinder.
Yeah, kind of making some assumptions, some odd assumptions on things that don't, on nothing really, on the idea of truth. So search and rescue often have many calls for service, and they often come in clumps, and you'll get a bunch in a row. I know one of the local search and rescue teams here last year had, I think, 3 searches in one weekend. And some can be extremely difficult searches due to weather, age of the person that's missing, or the circumstances with the person, or the people that are missing. How do search and rescue responders know if they are mentally ready for the next call?
Well, if you'd asked that question 10 years ago, they didn't. There wasn't that much attention paid to mental health. It's suck it up and get out there and do your job. And the way that manifested is some unhealthy behaviors, with maybe drinking a bit too much, having terrible relationships, sitting indoors when you should be outdoors, like having a good time. Now there's been a lot more understanding of this impact, long-term impact of stress, cumulative stress. And the work of Laura McGladrey with the Responder Alliance is a really good example of where she adapted the stress continuum, which was basically a spectrum that was developed by the Marine Corps in the United States to look at combat readiness. So she adapted that to first responders. And it's amazing because it helps you identify where you're functioning, where you're in a really good position, and then where you might be having a little bit of an injury or actually having a serious injury towards PTSD, where you need professional help. And we teach that now to responders and ski patrol and police officers to help them self-diagnose, not as a therapist or a counselor, but to give peers a tool to go, oh, you're actually hurting a little bit right now. We need to set something up with professional care. And that's saved me. I had an incident a few years ago where I had got to the point where I tell this story that I was really hungry and I went to the refrigerator and I opened it up and I had fantastic stuff to make sandwiches. I mean, it was unbelievable. It was organic, everything, great bread, but it was so much that was going on. I just shut the refrigerator and went back and just got into bed and pulled the blankets over my head. And that inability to deal with complexity is an indicator of a high level of trauma, a high level of damage. And that was the key point in recognizing I needed help. And so I sort of evangelize a bit about the stress continuum because they see its relevance, because it worked for me. It doesn't work for everybody, but it has the diagnostic tool to put you back to a place where you have high functionality.
And it's important to be ready. You talk about that. Years ago, you didn't even think about that. It made me think of a call that I was on as a firefighter where a child we thought had fallen into some fast-moving water. And I remember when the call came in, I worked at a spot where there was a couple firefighters there, and we ran out of the door together, drove up to the station. And I remember driving up and thinking, this was a perfect day for this, because a week ago, I was not in a spot for this kind of call, but I'm ready for this call today. I'm ready to go. And we had another not too long after that for a rescue of a similar thing in a water rescue. And I wasn't in that place, so I didn't go. And I just did not respond. So I wasn't in that initial response. So you have to be prepared to go in. And it's not just the role that you'll be doing, it's the rest of life that you have to consider as well. What's going on in life? Are there stressful moments in your life right now that once you get out there and add some more stress to it, that they might not put you in a good position?
Well, it's fragility. We work in an environment where that honesty and that fragility is seen quite often as a negative and a failure to be, and it's going to be gendered here, a man, to be able to suck it up. And actually, sucking it up just means that when you actually break, it's going to be a lot more dramatic. It's going to be a lot more, there's a fatalist attitude element to it. There's a horrific statistic around people ending their lives who've worked in emergency services because of this build-up and never having that healthy relationship where they've been able to be honest and supported by a peer group because they've been belittled or ostracized. And I see a shift. It isn't there yet, but there's a shift to actually having more open conversation about mental health. And the sooner that happens, the better it is for all of us, because people will live healthier, longer lives.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people that work search and rescue will work in search and rescue for decades.
Yeah.
And they built a lot of skill in that time. So it's really important to keep them healthy for those decades that they're working and keep them going. That skill is really important. I'm always amazed when I'm out there with the older folks that are on the crew and what their perspective is on a search and how things are going, because they will bring so much to the table from what they've seen before. And when they're in a good, healthy spot, it is, when you're in a good, healthy spot, it is invaluable what you get from those folks that are have that experience behind them.
And they have a responsibility to be practicing positive mental health. They can't model what was the 1970s. They have to model where we're at right now. And that's everything from language, openness, gender equality, all of these pieces we need to model as older people. Because if we don't, we lose that next generation coming up. And I think that's underestimated, the sort of mentorship, internship piece that needs to happen is old dogs need to learn new tricks. It's okay. It's not scary. Go for it. You'll be surprised how much happier you are. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I can only speak to the fire service, but when I joined my second department that I was in, one of the coolest parts was we had a lot of young members come in that were 10 to 15 years younger than me. And just what they taught me as I came in, it was really cool to have that back and forth between the two age groups, and really enjoyed it. Thank you. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Thanks for your shares, reviews, and emails. Hello to our listeners in Azerbaijan, and to listeners in these communities: Verlos, Denmark; Waltham Forest, England; Hayes, Kansas; Moscow, Russia; Conception Bay, South, Newfoundland and Labrador. This little podcast is heard or watched in over 350 communities around the world. We couldn't be more thankful for it. If you could do me a favor and send this podcast to professors you know so they could use this content in their classroom, I hope it will make our next generation a bit more prepared for what they will experience in the field. Wherever you listen, whether it's Spotify, iTunes, or Amazon Music, please subscribe, leave a review, and share with a friend. Next up, I've got 3 questions for you. Are you ready for them?
I am ready to go.
All right. So first one is one book, documentary, or resource that you recommend for those learning about crisis or emergency management.
Or anything about Shackleton's expedition to Antarctica. It's a great text with lots of perspectives about good leadership and the idea that you can have a horror multi-year marooning and then lose nobody on your crew is a fantastic example of great adaptive leadership.
Okay, really good one. Excellent. So what advice would you give information officers or communicators managing crises or emergencies that would help them to do their job better?
Take notes. Make sure you have a script. I mean, like everybody's had a moment where they've said something and said, "Oh, I shouldn't have said that." And so I think having something that's really holding you accountable when you're standing in front of a group of people or you're delivering it to a smaller group, make sure you have a script that has good notes on it so you have good facts and you don't mess everything up. It's okay to have that level of organization. And as somebody who's shot from their hips for many, many years, like I can wing it with the best of them, I know I am the poster child for making sure I have a good script going into a meeting.
How do you maintain your mental well-being during the most intense response moments?
I have a little phone tree. When I go out on something that's a bit challenging, I phone around to friends that I've had for 20 or 30 years from wilderness guiding, or I text them and I say, "Hey, I'm going out on a mission." And they all know, this pool of people know that I'm out there, and I'll start getting texts. So I have a lot of connection on that. I'm really honest with my feelings. I really rely on my wife. So I'll come back and she'll be like, what happened? And she'll listen to it and doesn't necessarily have to ask too many questions, just lets this narrative come out. And then decompression at the end of it is giving yourself the room to stop and have a bit of a dysfunctional day. Healthy dysfunction. So everything you don't do any dishwashing that day, or you eat a bunch of junk food, or you watch a lot of TV. It's this idea that you give your brain enough room to start to reset. I look at a mission as a concussive event, like being hit in the head, where with concussion, you have to rest, you have to slow down, you have to take the intensity off. You need to basically allow the brain and the body to flick the switch to say you're safe, don't need to be hyper aroused. And when that comes along, it's a bit discombobulating, and have the room to do that.
All right. Thank you so much for joining me, Moose. It's been interesting to hear your perspectives on the role and the importance of strong communication with families during crisis.
Thank you, Tim. I really enjoyed it.
You can get a copy of Moose Mutlow's books on Amazon, When Accidents Happen, Managing Crisis Communications as a Family Liaison Officer, and his other book, Searching, which is Finding Purpose, Laughter, and Distraction Through Search and Rescue. So thank you very much for joining me today, Moose, on the Wildfires, Floods, and Chaos Communications podcast. Thank you for listening and taking time to learn from our guests. Do you have suggestions for a guest or topic, or maybe some thoughts about one of our episodes? You can write to us at communicationspodcast.com, where you can also leave a review. This concludes our episodes for Season 2, and we already have Season 3 in development for the new year. I want to thank my guests and listeners who have been so supportive of the podcast and were patient as we learned how to become podcasters. As you take some time with friends and family over the holidays, put the device down. Be in the moment. Take time to rest your body and your mind. Wherever you listen, whether it's Spotify, iTunes, or Amazon Music, please subscribe and share with a colleague or friend, such as someone in search and rescue. Remember, we also have a newsletter that will give you more information, and we put up transcripts, links, and information from our podcast on our website at communicationspodcast.com. If you like this episode, check out Season 1, Episode 4, Crisis on the Ground, Public Outreach and Personal Recovery with Lloyd Peel. Thank you for joining the Wildfires, Floods, and Chaos Communications podcast, a production of Butterfly Effect Communications. We are masters of doom and gloom communication, bringing calm to chaos. Enjoy the holidays and eat a bit extra off the sweet table and tell them Tim told you to if you're caught. Goodbye. Hear me later.